Hello, ecology. Let's go over core concept number 3, where we are zeroing in on species interactions. And this is where we're looking at that relationship between ecology and evolutionary biology more closely. So our core concept number 3 states that species and species interactions within biomes are the products of evolution by natural selection and are threatened by human activities. And so what we're doing here, first off, with the very first learning objectives, is we're reviewing the relationships between our scales of biological organization, with the biome being the largest, then the ecosystem, then the community. And with these interactions, we are looking at both community level interactions between different species within a community. That would be interspecific competition, as well as intraspecific competition on that population level in these examples that look at single species interactions within the environment. So keep all that straight. That's one of the things to notice in this unit. Are you looking at interactions between two or more species? That's going to be interspecific competition. Or are you looking at the competitive interactions of individuals in a single population of a single species? That's going to be intraspecific competition. So state the 3 groups of species found in a biotic community. You had the producers. That's where every calorie within every diet of every organism within a community begins, is with those photosynthetic reactions. Those are our autotrophic organisms. You then have the consumers. They're all heterotrophic, as well as the decomposers that are also heterotrophic. And those decomposers return those building blocks of body tissues, which becomes food for the consumers, back down to the base of the ecosystem and the community. Define the following interactions, and it goes over. I'm going to switch the camera just a second to show you the slide that this is going to correspond to. Can I switch my camera during? Well, shame on that. Well, I tell you what we're going to do. We are just going to turn this around and go old-fashioned. And so we're looking here at this table where we go through and define the different species interactions that you have studied before, looking at the ones you know very, very well with predator-prey interactions, as well as some of the ones that may be new to you with parasitoidism, amensalism, commensalism, and you're looking at the effect of that interaction on both species within the interaction, whether that interaction, most of these are direct interactions. And so if it is a positive effect, there is a maintenance of fitness within that population. If there is a negative effect, then there is a negative impact of fitness within that population. Or just a negative impact on the species will be fine in your definitions or in your explanations as well. Direct interactions, think predator-prey. Indirect or diffuse interactions, that one figure at the very end of this lecture that goes over suites of species that act as pollinators for different plant species. Okay, so the middle section of this lecture, we start going into these interspecific interactions that can lead to patterns of selection. And what the chapter begins with is that mutually beneficial direct interaction between plants and their pollinators. And so one of the easiest ways to think about this is mutually beneficial. Go ahead and identify what is the benefit to each species that is involved in the interaction in the relationship. So for the plants, the benefit is pollination and gene flow. For the pollinator, it's food. And so the classic example that is mutually beneficial and indeed in many relationships is coevolutionary are the examples of the wasp pollinators with the orchids in tropical ecosystems. But then he also goes into several examples that are just interactions that are not that reciprocal change that we see in coevolutionary relationships and are simply plant and pollinator relationships. But again, they're mutually beneficial because the plant is getting pollinated and it aids in gene flow, and then for the pollinator species there is a food source. The next 2 things that I have in the learning objectives is where you can see this interaction and how the relationship between the sciences of evolutionary biology and ecology. So ecologists are studying these interactions of the species within the environment, and the evolutionary biologists would take those studies as well as their own and expand it to look at the changes in phenotypes as well as any changes in allele frequencies in populations over time. So the two examples that are given, the first one is an example of directional selection, and that is where you're looking at the interaction between the seed-eating bird species, just one species, and the response that is seen in the plant species in terms of seed size. And I'll let you review that. It's a plain old producer herbivore interaction where we see that pattern of directional selection over time. The next one, you have two competing bird species involved, and looking at the impact of those two species on one species of plant, and over time you get that diversifying selection to where you get, or it's also known as disruptive selection, but this is not a case of selection that's going as far as speciation. And then we get into the coevolutionary relationships, which again, the thing to remember is in a true coevolutionary relationship, if you have a change in species A, it's going to bring about a change in species B, and vice versa. A change in B is going to bring about a change in A. And the Brody's work on the rough-skinned newt and the garter snakes is explained. And what you want to look at is as there is an increase in toxin production in the newts, there is a corresponding reciprocal increase in the tolerance of that toxin in those populations of garter snakes that feed upon the rough-skinned newt. Now, as I stress in that, this is the common garter snake that we have here in Mississippi. They are non-venomous. They're all over the place. And garter snakes are, if you take a garter snake from Mississippi and you take it out west, it is going to die when it eats that newt because the presence of that newt is not there in the environment in Mississippi. There is no opportunity for the population of those garter snakes to develop any kind of resistance to that newt toxin. And vice versa, you don't have the newts. The newts are not toxic throughout their range. So, it is a neat study, and it is one that has many, many decades of research that has demonstrated that reciprocal relationship between the interactions of those two species. From that, we get into the idea of the ecological niche. I mentioned this in the review video I did for core concept number 1. You need to be able to differentiate between the fundamental niche or the tolerance range of a population of a species to a particular environmental variable, as well as the realized niche, which is the outcome of competition. You see realized niches in situations where there is interspecific interactions or interspecific competition going on between two different species for that same environmental variable, whereas within the fundamental niche, the kind of competition that you're seeing is all intraspecific competition. So lastly then, we talk about, describe the impacts of agriculture and urbanization on the number of species in a biotic community. Those two levels of change in the landscape will bring on a reduction in the native species in that area, as well as an increase in invasive species and exotic species, and just an overall decline in biodiversity. And this is something we're going to talk about more as we get in to community ecology in the second half of the course.